You think Julius Caesar died from a single noble stab to the heart. Wrong. The most powerful man in Rome was butchered like a wild animal, stabbed 23 times by men who smiled at him that very morning. His blood splattered across the white marble floor of the Senate while senators scrambled over each other to plunge their daggers into his body. Some wounds were so shallow they barely broke the skin. Others were deep enough to expose bone. This wasn't an execution. This was pure, unfiltered rage unleashed in the most sacred halls of Roman power. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March became synonymous with betrayal and blood. Caesar walked into that Senate meeting believing he was among allies. Minutes later, he was drowning in his own blood, surrounded by the very men who had sworn loyalty to him. Historical records tell us he tried to fight back at first, swinging his stylus like a weapon, desperately trying to ward off the first attackers. Then he saw Marcus Brutus among them, a man he loved like a son, and something inside him shattered. He stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head and let them finish what they started. The sheer brutality defies belief. 23 stab wounds. Let that sink in. Each senator wanted their blade wet with Caesar's blood, not for tactical reasons but to share the guilt equally. Some struck his face. Others targeted his groin in a final act of humiliation. Blood pooled around his body so thick that later accounts describe senators slipping in it as they fled the scene. The man who conquered Gaul, who crossed the Rubicon, who transformed Rome forever, reduced to a mangled corpse at the base of Pompey's statue. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Caesar died at the feet of his former rival's image. What you don't learn in school is how personal this murder was. These weren't hired assassins or foreign enemies. These were men who had dined at Caesar's table, who had accepted his favors, who had benefited from his generosity. They knew his habits, his schedule, his weaknesses. They knew he would come alone because Caesar prided himself on accessibility to the Senate. They knew he would dismiss his Spanish bodyguards because appearing fearful would damage his carefully crafted image of invincibility. The medical examinations performed centuries later on historical accounts reveal something even more disturbing. Of those 23 wounds, only 1 or 2 were potentially fatal. The rest were the frenzied slashing of men who had never killed before, who were so pumped with adrenaline and fear that they kept stabbing long after Caesar had stopped moving. Some reports claim Caesar's body twitched for several minutes after the attack stopped, his nervous system still firing as senators backed away in horror at what they'd done. Caesar's rise to absolute power reads like a manual on how to dismantle a democracy from within. He didn't storm Rome with armies at first. He seduced it with brilliant military victories and calculated political moves. By February 44 BCE, barely a month before his death, Caesar had accumulated more power than any single Roman in history. The Senate had just named him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life, not for a year, not for a decade, but forever. For senators who had spent their lives believing in the sacred balance of Roman governance, this was the death knell of everything they held dear. The speed of his ascent terrified Rome's elite. Just years earlier, Caesar had been one among many ambitious politicians. Then came the Gallic Wars. 8 years of systematic conquest that made Caesar fabulously wealthy and dangerously popular with the common people. He shared his spoils generously with his soldiers, creating an army more loyal to him personally than to Rome itself. When the Senate ordered him to disband his legions and return home for trial, Caesar made the choice that changed history. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army intact, effectively declaring war on the Republic itself. What followed was a civil war that left Caesar the undisputed master of Rome. His defeated enemies were treated with shocking clemency. Instead of executing them as tradition demanded, Caesar pardoned them and even appointed some to high offices. This mercy would prove fatal. Many of the men who would later plunge daggers into his body were those same pardoned enemies. Their gratitude curdled into resentment at owing their lives to his generosity. The transformation of Rome under Caesar's rule was breathtaking in its scope. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar we still essentially use today. He launched massive public works projects that employed thousands. He extended citizenship to people in far-flung provinces, diluting the traditional power of Roman elites. He packed the Senate with his supporters, increasing its size from 600 to 900 members. Every reform, every change, every innovation stripped away another piece of the old republic. But the final insult came with the rumors of kingship. Romans had expelled their last king centuries earlier and built their entire identity around never accepting monarchy again. Yet here was Caesar, accepting honors that seemed increasingly royal. A golden throne in the Senate, the right to wear triumphal dress at all public occasions, coins bearing his image, the first time a living Roman appeared on currency. When someone placed a crown on his statue, Caesar didn't order it removed immediately. When offered an actual crown at the Lupercalia festival, he refused it, but only after gauging the crowd's reaction. The senators watched their republic dying by 1,000 cuts. Every month brought new honors for Caesar, new powers, new precedents that pushed Rome closer to one-man rule. They saw him planning campaigns against Parthia that would take him away from Rome for years, leaving his puppet Senate to rubber-stamp his decisions. They realized that if they didn't act soon, the Roman Republic would exist only as a hollow shell, a facade maintained while real power rested forever in the hands of one man and his successors. Cassius Longinus started recruiting for the assassination in January 44 BCE, just weeks after Caesar became dictator for life. You have to understand, whiners organizing a murder plot in ancient Rome wasn't like modern conspiracy theories suggest. There were no secret meetings in dark basements. These were senators who had to see Caesar regularly, had to smile at him, had to pretend loyalty while planning his death. Cassius was clever about his recruitment. He didn't approach people directly at first. Instead, he left anonymous notes on the statues of Brutus's ancestors, messages that said things like, "Your ancestors gave us freedom, and are you truly a Brutus?" The psychological warfare worked. Marcus Brutus, despite his close relationship with Caesar, some even whispered Caesar might be his biological father, joined the conspiracy by February. His involvement transformed the plot from a desperate gamble to a legitimate political movement. The Brutus name carried weight that Cassius's never could. His ancestor had expelled the last king of Rome. Now he would kill the man trying to become the next one. Recruiting conspirators required delicate judgment. Approach the wrong person and the plot dies before it begins. The conspirators looked for specific traits: senators who had been humiliated by Caesar, those who had lost property in the civil wars, traditionalists appalled by Caesar's reforms. They avoided anyone too close to Caesar personally, anyone who owed their entire career to his patronage. Each new recruit was carefully vetted, often through indirect conversations that danced around the real topic until both parties were certain of mutual intent. The planning sessions were exercises in paranoia. Conspirators met in small groups, never all together, often at religious gatherings where their presence wouldn't raise suspicion. They debated endlessly about when and where to strike. Some wanted to attack Caesar on the Via Sacra as he walked to the Forum. Others suggested ambushing him at the elections. A few even proposed killing him at a gladiatorial show, using the chaos of the crowd as cover. Each plan was dissected and discarded for various flaws. Too public, too risky, too many variables. The breakthrough came when they learned the Senate would meet on March 15th at the Theater of Pompey instead of the regular Senate House. The theater's entrance created a natural bottleneck where Caesar would be vulnerable. Better still, weapons were technically forbidden in the Senate, but small daggers could be concealed under togas. The date also held symbolic weight. The Ides of March was a traditional settling of debts. What greater debt existed than the one Caesar owed to the republic he was destroying? As the conspiracy grew to nearly 60 members, maintaining secrecy became almost impossible. They developed a crude system of recognition, specific phrases, particular ways of arranging their togas, subtle hand signals during Senate meetings. The stress was crushing. Several conspirators reported nightmares, insomnia, sudden weight loss. Brutus's wife Porcia noticed his strange behavior and wounded herself to prove she could keep secrets under torture. The tension ratcheted higher when fortune-tellers and soothsayers began warning Caesar about the Ides of March, making the conspirators wonder if their plot had leaked or if the gods themselves were trying to warn their target. The morning of March 15, 44 BCE started like any other for Julius Caesar, except it wouldn't end that way. Not even close. This was the day Rome's most powerful man would bleed out on the Senate floor, surrounded by men he trusted with the empire's future. Caesar almost didn't go to the Senate that day. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares all night, visions of her husband's bloodied body, the roof of their house collapsing. She begged him to stay home. The priests found disturbing omens in the sacrificial animals that morning. Even Caesar himself felt uneasy, something gnawing at his gut that he couldn't quite place. A teacher named Artemidorus tried to warn him. Pushed through the crowds outside Caesar's house with a scroll listing every conspirator's name. Caesar took it but never read it. Too many petitions, too many people wanting his attention. That unread scroll would haunt Roman history forever. By mid-morning, the conspirators were panicking. Caesar was late. Rumors spread that he might cancel the Senate meeting entirely. Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's closest allies and secretly a lead conspirator, volunteered to fetch him personally. The man Caesar had named in his will arrived at his door with a smile and reassurances. The nightmares were just dreams. The Senate was waiting to honor him with new territories to conquer. How could Caesar refuse his trusted friend? The theater of Pompeii wasn't the usual Senate meeting place. Renovations had displaced them to this temporary location. Ironic that Caesar would die in a building named for Pompey, his former rival in civil war, a rival whose statue would soon be drenched in Caesar's blood. As Caesar's litter approached the theater, a soothsayer grabbed his toga, the same prophet who'd warned him weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. Caesar laughed it off. "The Ides of March have come," he said. The old man's response chilled the surrounding crowd. "Yes, but they have not gone." Inside the theater, 60 senators waited. Not all were conspirators, but around 23 actively gripped daggers beneath their togas. Some hands trembled. Others remained steady with resolve. Professional soldiers mixed with pampered aristocrats who'd never drawn blood. They'd practiced their positions, rehearsed their roles, but nothing could prepare them for what came next. Caesar entered surrounded by his usual entourage, but the conspirators had planned for this. Senator Julius Caesar approached with a petition about his exiled brother, a prearranged signal. As Caesar brushed him aside, Caesar grabbed Caesar's toga with both hands, yanking it down from his shoulders. The garment that marked Caesar's rank now trapped his arms. Caesar's eyes went wide. "This is violence," he shouted. Those 3 words were the last coherent thing anyone would hear from him, because that's when the knives came out. 23 men descended on a single target, 23 daggers seeking flesh. This wasn't the coordinated assassination you see in movies. This was chaos incarnate. The first blade came from Servilius Casca, aimed at Caesar's neck but glancing off his shoulder instead. Caesar spun around, grabbed Casca's wrist, and for a moment it looked like Rome's greatest general might fight his way out. He still had Casca's arm when the second dagger punched into his ribs. Then the third. Then the fourth. What followed was less assassination, more feeding frenzy. Senators shoved each other trying to get close enough to stab. In the melee they wounded each other. Brutus took a dagger to his thigh. Cassius nearly lost an eye. Blood slicked the marble floor. Men slipped, fell, got back up to stab again. Caesar fought back initially. Years of military campaigns had honed his instincts. He threw one attacker into a pillar, broke another's nose with his elbow. But 23 against 1, those aren't odds even Caesar could beat. The daggers came from everywhere. His back, his chest, his arms as he tried to shield himself. Some barely broke the skin, nervous senators with shaking hands managing only glancing blows. Others drove deep, hunting for organs. Blood soaked through his toga, turning the white wool crimson. Historical accounts describe the sound. Not screaming, Caesar stayed silent after his initial shout, but the wet sound of metal penetrating flesh, again and again, the grunts of effort from the attackers. The slip of sandals on bloody marble. Some witnesses vomited. Others stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Midway through the attack, Caesar spotted Marcus Brutus among his attackers. Sources differ on what happened next. Some say Caesar switched from Latin to Greek, gasping "Kai su teknon? You too, my son." Others claim he said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. Brutus, whom he'd mentored, whom some whispered might be his illegitimate child, raising a dagger against him. That's when Caesar stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head like a hood, a final gesture of dignity, hiding his face from the world. Or maybe he just couldn't bear to watch Brutus deliver his blow. The frenzy continued even after Caesar stopped moving. Senators who'd hung back pushed forward, needing to bloody their blades to prove their commitment to the cause. They stabbed a corpse to claim their part in tyrannicide. By the end, 23 wounds decorated Caesar's body, though he'd likely died after the 10th. When the madness finally ended, Caesar lay at the base of Pompey's statue. His former enemy's marble face gazed down at the scene, spattered with Caesar's blood. The parallel wasn't lost on the Romans. In death, Caesar had literally fallen at his rival's feet. The medical evidence tells us most of Caesar's wounds were survivable. Punctures to his arms, shoulders, and back that bled impressively but missed major arteries. Defensive wounds on his hands where he'd grabbed at blades. Shallow cuts from hesitant conspirators who discovered that actually driving a knife into human flesh required more force than they'd anticipated. Modern forensic analysis of the historical accounts suggests Caesar could have survived 22 of his 23 wounds. The killing blow came from a dagger that slipped between his ribs and found something vital. Witnesses described a sudden gush of blood from Caesar's mouth, the telltale sign of a punctured lung filling with blood, or worse, a nicked aorta. That single wound would have killed him in minutes. The aorta is the body's main highway for blood flow. Nick it, and you've essentially cut the fuel line to every organ. Blood pressure drops instantly. The brain, starved of oxygen, shuts down in stages. First confusion, then unconsciousness, then death. But Caesar might have drowned in his own blood before bleeding out. A punctured lung creates a one-way valve. Air and blood flow into the chest cavity but can't escape. The lung collapses. Breathing becomes impossible. Each attempt to inhale draws more blood into the airways. It's like drowning in reverse. The liquid comes from inside rather than outside. The sheer volume of blood would have been staggering. The human body contains roughly 5 liters of blood. Major wounds can empty half of that in minutes. The Senate floor became a crimson lake. Senators slipped and fell in it as they fled the scene. Their footprints tracked bloody paths throughout Rome, literally spreading evidence of the deed across the city. Some wounds told their own story. The defensive cuts on Caesar's hands and forearms showed he'd fought back hard. Deep punctures in his back revealed the cowardice of attackers who couldn't face him head-on. Bruises around the wounds indicated multiple strikes in the same location, the frantic stabbing of panicked men rather than the precise strikes of trained killers. The pattern of wounds also revealed the attack's chaotic nature. No two chroniclers agreed on the exact number. Some counted 23, others 35. The discrepancy likely came from counting entry and exit wounds separately, or including cuts that barely broke the skin. In their frenzy, some senators probably stabbed wounds that already existed, driving their blades into holes created by others. Roman physicians who examined the body noted something chilling. Several wounds showed signs of hesitation marks. Small cuts near deeper wounds where the attacker had started to strike, pulled back, then struck again with more force. These men weren't hardened killers. They were politicians playing at assassination, and it showed in every tentative wound. The single fatal wound likely came early in the attack, meaning Caesar spent his final moments being butchered unnecessarily. He was already dying when Brutus struck, already fading when the latecomer senators bloodied their blades. The overkill wasn't about ensuring death, it was about shared culpability. Every senator with blood on his blade became equally guilty, equally bound to the conspiracy's success. But even in death, the problem with piecing together Caesar's assassination is that our best sources were writing decades after the blood dried on the Senate floor. Suetonius wasn't even born until 69 AD. That's over a century after Caesar bled out. He based his accounts on palace archives, personal letters, and stories passed down through generations of Romans who each added their own spin. Plutarch came along even later, writing his version around 100 AD. By then, Caesar had transformed from a murdered dictator into Rome's most legendary figure. Both writers had access to documents we'll never see, private correspondence between senators, official reports filed after the assassination, even eyewitness testimonies that have long since crumbled to dust. What makes their accounts fascinating isn't their perfection, it's their contradictions. Suetonius claims Caesar received 23 wounds. Plutarch agrees on the number but argues over which ones actually killed him. The physician Antistius, who examined Caesar's corpse, insisted only one wound was fatal, a deep thrust between the ribs that punctured his aorta. The other 22, shallow cuts inflicted by panicked senators who'd never killed anyone before. Cassius Dio throws another wrench into the narrative. Writing in the 3rd century, he describes senators literally climbing over each other to stab Caesar. Some accidentally wounded their fellow conspirators in the frenzy. Blood made the marble floor slippery. Senators slipped in gore while trying to escape. One detail all sources agree on. Caesar initially tried to fight back. When the first blade struck, he grabbed the handle and shouted at Casca in Latin. Only when he saw how many senators had drawn daggers did he stop resisting. The most disturbing detail comes from multiple sources. Caesar wrapped his toga around his head before falling. Some claim this was dignity, a dictator controlling how he'd be remembered even while dying. Others suggest pure instinct, covering his face like a child hiding from monsters. Either way, those final moments reveal something profoundly human about Rome's most powerful man. These ancient writers weren't just recording history, they were crafting narratives for their own political purposes. Suetonius served Emperor Hadrian, and had reasons to portray Caesar's death as inevitable justice. Plutarch wrote moral biographies meant to teach Greek readers about Roman character. Their accounts filter Caesar's death through layers of agenda, mythology, and simple human error. Yet certain details appear too frequently to dismiss. The sheer chaos of the attack. Blood pooling at the base of Pompey's statue. Caesar's former rival watching in stone as his enemy died at his feet. Senators fleeing immediately after, leaving Caesar's body abandoned on the Senate floor for hours. These aren't the details writers invent. They're the messy realities that stick in memory and survive through centuries of retelling. Shakespeare gave us the 3 most famous words never actually spoken in the Roman Senate. Et tu, Brute, has echoed through 4 centuries of performances, permanently welding itself to Caesar's assassination, except Caesar probably never said it. The real phrase, according to Suetonius, was spoken in Greek, kai su teknon, you too, my child. But even this comes with an asterisk. Suetonius himself admits uncertainty, writing that Caesar said nothing at all, or perhaps spoke these words. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of authenticity, Shakespeare lifted his version from earlier Renaissance writers who'd already been embellishing the story for generations. Each retelling added more drama, more poetry, more perfect tragedy. By the time Shakespeare put quill to parchment in 1599, Caesar's death had evolved from messy political murder into high art. The genius of Et tu, Brute lies in its simplicity. 3 syllables that compress an entire relationship into a dying gasp. It transforms Brutus from just another conspirator into the central betrayer, the adopted son who drives the final emotional dagger. Shakespeare understood what historians often miss. People remember feelings, not facts. Roman sources tell a different story about Caesar's last moments. Cassius Dio claims Caesar said nothing once he saw Brutus among the assassins. He simply covered his head and surrendered to the blades. Plutarch describes Caesar fighting until he spotted Brutus, then giving up resistance. The message stays consistent. Brutus was the wound that truly killed Caesar, whether he spoke or not. This matters because the myth has overridden history. Modern politicians invoke et tu, Brute when colleagues betray them. The phrase has become shorthand for ultimate treachery. We've collectively agreed to remember Shakespeare's version over messier historical truth. Some scholars suggest Caesar's actual last words were completely different. Plutarch mentions Caesar shouting at Casca, his first attacker, "Villain Casca, what are you doing?" in Latin. If Caesar switched to Greek when addressing Brutus, a language of private conversation among educated Romans, it would have carried intimate weight. Speaking Greek meant dropping all pretense, all public persona. It was the language of philosophy, of private teaching, of relationships that transcended politics. The relationship between Caesar and Brutus runs deeper than Shakespeare could explore in 5 acts. Rumors persisted that Brutus was Caesar's biological son. His mother Servilia had been Caesar's lover for decades. Caesar had showered Brutus with honors, forgiven him for fighting against him in the Civil War, promoted him above more loyal supporters. Whether connected by blood or just affection, their bond made the betrayal genuinely devastating. Yet even this emotional core might be posthumous invention. Writers love parallel structures. Caesar's political heir Augustus later defeating Caesar's possible biological son in battle. The poetry writes itself. History rarely provides such clean narratives without human help. What definitely happened? 23 stab wounds, death on the Senate floor, Brutus among the killers, already contained enough tragedy. Everything else, including the most famous death quote in Western literature, might be humanity's attempt to make sense of senseless political violence. Rome woke on March 16th to find its dictator dead and its Senate in chaos. The conspirators expected celebration. They'd prepared speeches about liberty and republican virtue. Instead, they found a city paralyzed by confusion and fear. The first crowds gathered cautiously around Caesar's abandoned estate. Some came to mourn, others to verify the impossible news. Caesar's veterans, men who'd followed him through Gaul and across the Rubicon, stood guard around his property without orders. They'd conquered the known world under his command. Now they didn't even know who to fight. Inside the city, reactions split along invisible fractures. The urban poor, who'd benefited from Caesar's grain distributions and public works, wept openly. Shopkeepers who'd grown rich from his wars worried about their futures. Senators who'd avoided the conspiracy hid in their homes, calculating which side would win the coming struggle. The conspirators had catastrophically misread their audience. They'd prepared for the abstract Roman citizenry they discussed in philosophy texts. lovers of republican virtue who'd thank them for removing a tyrant. They found instead real Romans who cared more about stable grain prices than constitutional theory. Marcus Brutus discovered this personally when he tried to address a crowd in the Forum. He'd written a careful speech explaining the noble principles behind the assassination. The crowd listened in stony silence until someone shouted a question about Caesar's will. Did he leave anything to the people? Would his building projects continue? Who would pay the legions? Brutus had no answers. He'd planned Caesar's death meticulously but given no thought to the day after. The real shock came during Caesar's funeral. Mark Antony read Caesar's will publicly. Every Roman citizen would receive 300 sesterces. Caesar's private gardens would become public parks. Then Antony pulled back Caesar's toga, revealing all 23 wounds. The crowd exploded. They built a pyre right there in the Forum, feeding it with furniture ripped from nearby buildings. When a wax figure of Caesar appeared, showing each stab wound in detail, mourning turned to rage. Rioters hunted conspirators through the streets. They caught Helvius Cinna, a poet who shared a name with one of the assassins. The mob tore him apart despite his protests of innocence. His actual identity didn't matter. The crowd needed blood to answer blood. Other conspirators fled Rome entirely, abandoning the republic they'd claimed to save. Within days, Rome divided into armed camps. Caesar's supporters controlled the streets while the conspirators held the Capitol Hill. Veterans arrived from outside the city, choosing sides based on old loyalties and new opportunities. The assassination meant to prevent civil war had instead guaranteed it. The bitter irony escaped no one. By killing Caesar to save the Republic, the conspirators had destroyed it. Their noble ideals crashed against the reality that most Romans preferred Caesar's stability to their chaos. The man who'd conquered Gaul couldn't defeat a Senate plot, but his ghost would destroy the entire republican system. Democracy died not with Caesar but because of his death, murdered by men who thought themselves its saviors. Rome wasn't saved the day Caesar died. The senators who plunged their daggers into his body thought they were liberating the republic. They couldn't have been more wrong. Within hours of Caesar's blood pooling on the Senate floor, the city descended into chaos that would last for 13 years. The conspirators expected celebrations in the streets. Instead, they got riots. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, seized control before the assassins could even wash the blood from their hands. He grabbed Caesar's will, his papers, and most importantly, his fortune. Then he did something the conspirators never anticipated. He turned Caesar into a martyr. The funeral changed everything. Antony didn't just give a speech. He orchestrated a piece of political theater so devastating it sent the assassins fleeing for their lives. He held up Caesar's blood-soaked toga, counting out each of the 23 holes for the crowd. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing that the dictator had left 75 denarii to every Roman citizen and his private gardens to the people. The mob went berserk. They burned down the houses of the conspirators. They murdered a poet named Cinna just because he shared a name with one of the assassins. The power vacuum Caesar left behind became a bloodbath. 3 men emerged to fill it: Mark Antony, who controlled Caesar's veterans and fortune; Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old adopted son who inherited his name and legacy; and Lepidus, a wealthy general with crucial military support. These 3 formed the Second Triumvirate, and their first act makes Caesar look merciful by comparison. They compiled prescription lists, death warrants for their enemies. 300 senators and 2,000 wealthy Romans were marked for execution. Their property was seized, their families destroyed. The assassins who killed Caesar to save the Republic were now watching that same Republic devour itself. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator who had celebrated Caesar's death, was hunted down and beheaded. His hands were cut off and nailed to the Senate door, the same hands that had written speeches against tyranny. The triumvirate didn't last. Power-sharing agreements rarely do when the stakes are absolute control of the known world. Lepidus was pushed aside first. Then came the inevitable showdown between Antony and Octavian. 13 years of civil war followed Caesar's assassination. Hundreds of thousands died in battles from Spain to Greece. The Republic bled out on 1,000 battlefields. When the dust settled, a 20-year-old who called himself Augustus stood alone as master of Rome. The same Augustus who had been Caesar's adopted son, who had used his name and fortune to destroy every institution the conspirators had tried to save. The Republic was dead, replaced by an empire that would last 500 years. The senators had stabbed Caesar 23 times to prevent one-man rule. They succeeded only in guaranteeing it. Every emperor who followed traced their authority back to Caesar. His name became the title: Finer, Caesar, Kaiser, Czar. The man they killed to save Rome became the template for every autocrat who followed. The dark comedy of Caesar's assassination is carved into history. The conspirators were pardoned initially, then hunted down and killed one by one. Brutus and Cassius died by their own swords at Philippi, their legions crushed by the forces of Caesar's heirs. Not a single major conspirator died peacefully in their beds. They had committed the ultimate political miscalculation. They killed the man but not the system he created. You're told Caesar's assassination was political murder. The sources you trust present it as established fact. 23 stabs, a too brute, the noble sacrifice to save the Republic. History textbooks serve you a clean narrative where desperate patriots struck down a tyrant. The truth is messier, bloodier, and far more human. Start with the stabbing count. 23 wounds sounds precise, mathematical even. Ancient sources actually disagree. Nicolaus of Damascus, writing closer to the event than Plutarch or Suetonius, claims there were 35 wounds. The physician Antistius, who examined Caesar's corpse, stated most wounds were superficial. Only 1 or 2 penetrated deep enough to kill. The chaos in that Senate chamber was so complete that conspirators were accidentally stabbing each other in the frenzy. That precise number you learned? It's educated guesswork hardened into fact through repetition. The location itself has been twisted by time. You envision Caesar dying on the Senate steps, maybe even inside the Senate house itself. Wrong. The actual Senate building was under construction. The meeting took place in Pompey's Theater, a massive entertainment complex. Caesar died beneath a statue of Pompey, the very man he had defeated in civil war. The irony was lost on no one, but somewhere in the retelling, the theater became the Senate House because it sounded more official, more appropriate for such a momentous death. Then there's the most famous last words never actually spoken. Et tu, brute, appears nowhere in contemporary accounts. Suetonius, writing over a century later, claims Caesar said nothing at all. Others report he gasped, "You too, my child," in Greek, not Latin. Shakespeare gave us the Latin phrase because it sounded better in iambic pentameter. A playwright's invention became historical truth simply because people preferred the drama. The conspirators themselves have been sanitized into noble patriots. Modern depictions show 60 senators united in purpose. The reality was a paranoid, disorganized mob. They were so terrified of discovery that they could barely coordinate their attack. Several conspirators begged Caesar to postpone the Senate meeting that day, either from cold feet or genuine affection. Others arrived late. Some struck only token blows to claim participation without actually killing. This wasn't a unified political movement. It was barely controlled panic dressed up as principle. Even Caesar's response has been mythologized. The image of him pulling his toga over his head in dignified acceptance, that comes from sources writing generations later, crafting meaning from chaos. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting back initially, using his stylus as a weapon, trying to break free. Only when he saw the sheer number of attackers did he stop struggling. His last act wasn't noble resignation. It was recognizing the futility of resistance. The physical details reveal the gap between myth and reality. Those 23 wounds, many were post-mortem, inflicted on an already dead or dying man. Several conspirators deliberately bloodied their blades on Caesar's corpse just to show they had participated. The actual killing was quick, brutal, and nothing like the synchronized political execution we imagine. Our entire understanding of March 15, 44 BCE comes filtered through writers who weren't there, couldn't interview witnesses, and had their own political agendas. Plutarch wanted to craft moral lessons. Suetonius loved scandalous details. Shakespeare needed dramatic tragedy. Each layer of retelling added poetry while subtracting truth. The Assassination everyone knows is a collaborative fiction built from fragments of fact, political propaganda, and pure invention. The real Caesar didn't die spouting memorable Latin. He died confused, bleeding, and probably calling for help in Greek while men he had pardoned and promoted fought each other to plant knives in his body. That's the human truth buried under centuries of literary improvement, messy, chaotic, and infinitely more disturbing than any catchphrase could